Hello and welcome back. For this segment, we're going to take a look at another step from our curriculum. This is another proposal where we're talking about, let's see, it looks like AsyncPipe explicit refresh. I'm not quite sure what that is. Hopefully Zachary can help explain it. And so looking at the curriculum, they have a step here, and I'm looking at the net change of all the work that went into this branch. And looking through that, I see a couple of things. I see 202, a new proposed step 304. Now 202, this is actually a new proposed step as well, but we actually already have if else. We just have it normally much later in the curriculum, and I think we're probably going to leave it there in that later step in the curriculum. For what we're trying to achieve in the 200s, the if else, even though it's just a tiny little bit of syntax, it actually introduces quite a good number of topics. So whenever it introduces else, it introduces ng template, it introduces template variables, it introduces a syntactic sugar, additional syntactic sugar syntax on ng if. And so there's a lot of ways to get side railed from the main story that we're trying to teach in 200. And so I do like to leave this down in the reference area. And as the question comes up, say, it's actually kind of rare that you would need it. If you do, it's down there. You can look at it. The syntax is pretty straightforward, and we can circle back around to it during workshops or one-on-one or consulting time at the end, or Q&A sections at the end. So plenty of opportunity to get to it. I get to it in every class, but I don't want it as part of the main prescription in that 200 block. So I think we should probably leave that down there. But the reason it got moved up was, I believe, in the 304 that Zachary is going to explain to us, it ended up getting used. So we'll talk about that in a moment. So Zachary, explain what the point of this step was again.
So yeah, 304. This was like partially Chris and I wanting something. This came off of a completely different discussion, talking about AsyncPipe. But usually in any class I teach in AsyncPipe, I like to show off the third bit of functionality that AsyncPipe gives you, which is like rebinding to a new observable, so unsubscribing from the old one and subscribing to the new one. And to do that, I typically do either something that does like a reassigning of an observable or whatever.
What do you mean by a reassigning of an observable?
So like this step in particular doesn't show that off.
Okay.
So this was just like some of the lead up that led up to this thing. But typically I would do something where I just create a function that literally just calls like this.employees equals that pipeline again, and just reassigns a new observable to it. And then the async pipe just kind of takes care of it naturally, right? Because it's the third bit of functionality. This step went even further because Chris and I were talking about it, like, oh, what I would really like to actually show off, because the third bit of functionality is just kind of whatever, like there's not a huge use case for that.
So for the people who are watching later, what are the first two bits of functionality?
Yeah. So async pipe, like the three bits of functionality are one, it automatically subscribes to an observable for you, kind of like extracts that data and passes it out as a new variable in the template. The second bit of functionality is it allows for unsubscribing of said observable when the component's template itself like deconstructs during the destroy process. And then the third bit, which I just mentioned, is that if you reassign that observable to a new one, it'll actually unsubscribe from the old one, so do all the cleanup, and then subscribe to the new one and create that variable as well. So Chris and I were thinking, okay, that functionality is cool, but not super useful in terms of like actual like real life use cases.
No, why is that? Because I got feelings already.
Okay, so there are use cases, but the use case I was doing didn't make a lot of sense because I was trying to do a quote-unquote refresh button that just reassigned the observable. So, I mean, that works, obviously, it works. But in our case, we're like, okay, in what cases would we actually ever do that versus just having like a subject trigger that you just do a next on, it goes and does whatever process it needs to do, like with a switch map or whatever, and then does the refresh process like that, versus just like reassigning an entire new observable.
Yeah, that was the primary consideration. I was wanting to make sure that this was founded upon, was that the standard path is not to just reassign your observable, but to build your data flow such that whatever triggers that you would have that would trigger that update would actually flow into your pre-existing observable.
Right, yeah.
Okay, so yeah, so long as this demonstrates that in a way that clearly is separate from what should be the standard use case, then yeah, that we can definitely use such an example. So where are we at with this one? Does this step have the ability to demonstrate that, or is it still a work in progress?
This one, as far as I'm aware, I don't know where this is. Oh, so it's not inside the service, but down in the component, like the app component, which there probably needs to be a little bit more work done.
Inside app component
Yes.
TS right here.
So originally I wanted the subject in the service, but we just threw it in the component just for time's sake. But here we just have like a refresh subject. That's basically just a trigger subject. It's void. It doesn't really do anything besides just creating an event. And then whenever we want to quote unquote refresh the data, refresh the data on the UI, we click a button. It next a new event into the subject, and then in our constructor we actually have that whole pipeline being created of, we're using our subject as a baseline. So whenever an event runs through here, then we go and get our
We
data.
refresh. Yeah, we call service.employees. Yep.
And then we have a start with undefined because we wanted to use a subject versus behavior subject, which I didn't want to fight with, so I just let it go.
So
I really like this stuff because I'm also tired of live coding this.
I live code this every single time because it comes up.
So, the last part, initially he had that as a new behavior subject of undefined, and Kyle said, no, don't do that, do start with undefined. And Kyle's opinion is that no one should, or one should very rarely directly use behavior subjects.
Or even a replay subject. It's like,
Or replay subject. Yeah, we said behavior subject, then we said, oh, replay subject is more precise, and then he said, no one should even know that exists. Just use a subject with a start with.
Yeah, Kyle and I strongly disagree on that.
Okay.
So if you want to use a behavior subject, you're back in for using behavior subject.
Because the start with undefined there.
So like the back and forth he and I have had about that, and that Kyle is actually right, and that most people use a behavior subject in a bad way. Like very few people are using a behavior subject in a healthy way, and so like if you can just avoid using one at all, you'll never use it the wrong way. But on the flip side of that, like if what you're wanting is the ability to seed it with an initial value, have it do replay upon subscription, and if those are your true use cases, and you're not trying to go behind it and manually pull the data out, then yeah, you're good to go. Just use the behavior subject.
Or would you use a replay subject in this situation?
That goes back to let's see, replay subject. You don't seed those with initial value, do you?
You seed them, but you can't get the value out like you can with a behavior subject.
Okay, so then in that case, I think yes, a replay subject is also fine.
Yeah.
I have to go back and actually go look at the definitions. I always forget the distinction.
Okay.
But I'm perfectly fine with using any of the three whenever the situation is right for it. I don't remember the differences off the top of my head.
So that's a difference. That Kyle was the one in the room and not you.
Yeah.
It's because we would have written a replay subject and just moved on instead of having a 5-minute conversation. Okay.
Yep. No, we would have had a 10-minute conversation if I was in the room.
Right, yeah, probably.
If both of you were in the room.
Yep.
Fair enough.
Yeah, so I'm okay with that. I'm not okay with the $ on line 19.
That was because if we go to the HTML, like we just wanted to get the code in.
I know, but
I didn't want it either.
Paul has wrong opinions on this.
At this point, it doesn't matter if it's right or wrong. That's the way we've standardized on.
Yeah, but okay, then tell us what to use instead, and
You need to come up with a synonym for roster.
See, it won't be a problem when you actually do the async pipe across the component input.
If you do that,
which is just something that needs.
See, that's the other part of this. Like,
that's a good point.
It all feeds in. Like, you're not going to have these problems if we're doing the smart view. So tell us about that. Actually, we're kind of jumping ahead.
Yeah.
So yeah, keep going. Tell us about this code some more. So
Right.
we got the fetch the data, which will trigger a next on our refresh.
Right, and then we created that whole pipeline in the constructor where, like, since we're using a subject, we have to have a start with, so we just get something initially. But then whenever we actually have something running through that pipe, we do the switch map to go to our service to get that observable data, and then eventually, like, we assign that to roster $, which could just be roster. But if we go to the HTML, is where the rest of the story happens of us having relatively the same UI as AsyncPipe, but now we have that button on line 4 that goes and fetches the data, refreshes the data, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we don't need this, obviously, but that's why we moved the ngIf else, because we had a loading system where it's like, we could actually go and when we hit the refresh button, you'll actually see it go and loading the roster for a couple seconds or whatever.
We might have to add a delay to actually be able to see it.
I just slow down my network, but
that works too.
I'm lazy. But so we do that, right? So we have our ngIf of grabbing the roster, async piping it, exposing it as roster without a $ in the local variable, and then we have our else template variable that goes down to line 16 and says loading.
And then line 14, we are showing the as of, so that you can see each time you hit refresh that it actually is a different time. So that in the call, in the service, it's capturing the moment that
That's
happened.
one other change we made in the service that I forgot about.
Yeah, because otherwise you click refresh and there's no change whatsoever because it's the same date each time. That's the way to know that it's actually doing anything.
Right. Yeah, so the things that kind of jump to mind to kind of bring this in alignment with the rest of our curriculum is that lines 5 through 18. So for those, what I would do is I would actually break that out into a component. That would be just like your roster component.
Right. Yeah.
And then that would have an input, and it would actually, instead of doing the ng, if, as, else, etc., you just async pipe the roster into it. Removes the need to differentiate your two variable names. It also makes it so that you don't have to use an if else. You can just have an ng if negated on the bottom half inside the child component because you're not dealing with an async anymore. You're dealing with the input value. Which is or is not set.
And
so that reduces the number of tools we have to use, gives you better reusability, and reduces the overall template complexity. So it's just like a win-win-win to make that move. That's a trade-off for one more component, but you got a roster component now.
That's real life. Yeah.
So I think if we do all that, I love this idea also. I have to teach this all the time in my classes too, so definitely a good one to get in. Let's see, we've got, let me see where this would go. So you had this at 304 as a proposal?
We just threw it after.
Do I jump
after
on
AsyncPipe.
Because presumably they would need to know AsyncPipe before doing this.
Yeah,
but then again, maybe it needs to come slightly later. I don't know.
I wonder if it comes in the late 400, or not, around 402, 403, where we start doing more stuff with observables.
Or even after Smart.
Well, yeah, if we do it after 402, then they've got their...
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Well, actually, 403 is where we do the chaining, which you're going to need. No, we do a little bit of chaining.
We're not going to need chaining if we go to a replay subject.
That's true.
Yeah.
And if we don't need that...
Because most we do is a switch map, so it's not like...
Do you want to talk about replay subjects before you talk about observable chaining?
Yeah, that's a good point.
That's a good point.
And if we do it after the services step, then that's when we, like the services are when we are currently introducing subjects, aren't they?
BehaviorSubject, yeah. I just hope we're not like
404 is where we're currently introducing subjects.
Yeah, 404 is the first place that actually has it.
Does it use an actual subject or does it use a behavior?
Either way, like the idea of a subject.
Right, I'm just
not particularly concerned about which one we introduce
I'm
first.
Kind of worried about instructors having to like have a nailed down difference between.
Sorry, can you bring up the subject in 404? I'm having trouble visualizing where we use a sub. Oh, sorry. No.
Yeah, no, we've
got
got
two
this.
step 404s there.
Yeah, that empty directory.
Yep. No, I know where it is on that one.
Yeah, I'm leaning. I would love to do it at 304 if not for the subject.
Yeah.
But the subject is key to this thing. That's the way to...
I think it fits in well with the 403, 404.
I do too. In fact...
Well, and it's talking about state, right? It's like refreshing the state. So the 300s...
Yeah, it is more contextually in line with the 400s.
300s are really... I mean, yes, the 300s are about HTTP, and it's kind of like an additional way to like make HTTP calls, but I think it's not like... The 300s are kind of a how-to.
Right. Well, and this is absolutely vital whenever we start talking about this is the intersection between the 300s and 400s.
Yeah.
Like these two lines of code. Yeah, I would say let's tentatively mark it as 405 before we get to state with services.
We already have Are all these things real? The 4042, 444, and 446? Are those?
Like everyone's competing for step 405.
Yeah.
Apparently.
Well, streaming
Well,
data here has effectively nothing.
I think everybody was competing for step 405, but by the time those
Yeah.
steps get implemented,
Yeah,
that's not where they're going to go anymore.
Yeah, NGRX store, complex state with NGRX store. We've got. Let's see, is there even
Is
anything
that?
in that one?
Well, yeah, that's going to have to go.
We've got state with services, NGRX store immutability,
That was-
effects.
That was probably put in when NGRX was step 404.
Yeah.
Lots of leftover bits here.
Yeah, you got a 403 route parameters that's extra too.
NGRX isn't in 400s anymore, is it? Yeah.
Yeah, that's all leftover stuff.
Oh wow. That's interesting.
I'm not quite sure how this happens, but
Well, it happens because
so you'd be making our first 405 step actually.
Yeah. you got while you're deleting 403 route parameters is I think an empty one.
And one of the 402s and one of the 401s.
Very nested around.
Jeez.
And probably.
Cool.
Apparently there's been a lot of rearranging in this section.
Apparently.
Yeah, so let's move to 405 as the proposed step, make those changes, and I'd love to have that in.
Cool.
All right. Well, I think that does it for this session.
All right.
Thanks, folks.